On June 17, 1876, at Rosebud Creek, native warriors commanded by Crazy Horse halted General Crook's army in a fierce battle that lasted 6 hours. And this victory laid the groundwork for Custer's annihilation just 8 days later. Moments that change the course of history and shape the destinies of nations often remain in the shadow of great catastrophes or legendary victories. This is exactly the case in the bloody, tragic, and complex history of the American West. Today, when you flip through history books or watch documentaries, you see that the majority talk about the Battle of the Little Bighorn, General George Armstrong Custer's infamous, hubris-filled last stand, and the collapse of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. However, the true seeds of that legendary destruction, that shocking defeat, were actually sown just 8 days earlier in a wild, rugged, and merciless valley whose name few even mention. The Battle of the Rosebud was not just a military clash. It was the first great thunder that broke the calm before the storm, the grand reckoning that would determine the fate of an entire continent. To understand the background of this battle and the paths that led there that day is to essentially understand the spirit of that era, the desperate resistance of the native people, and their inevitable collision. By 1876, the tension between the American government and the native peoples of the Great Plains had reached an unbearable point of no return. At the center of everything was Paha Sapa, the Black Hills, considered the most sacred lands on earth for the Lakota Sioux and Northern Cheyennes. For the natives, Paha Sapa was not just a terrain to be hunted on. It was the place where spirits rested, where creation began, where prayers echoed. With the Fort Laramie Treaty signed in 1868, the highest levels of the American government guaranteed that these lands belonged to the natives forever, and that no white man could enter these lands without permission. The text of the treaty was very clear. As long as the sun shone and the waters flowed, these lands would belong to the Lakota. However, this sacred promise would succumb to the allure of that deadly yellow gleam seeping from beneath the earth. In 1874, by a strange and cruel twist of fate, when a massive expeditionary force again led by General Custer entered the Black Hills and found gold, all the treaties that were valid on paper until that day lost all their meaning. As the news spread, thousands of miners burning with gold fever and dreaming of getting rich began to flood into these sacred lands illegally. The American government initially gave the impression of stopping this influx, sending soldiers to the region and detaining a few miners, but the pressure from the public and the media was so great that they soon changed tactics. By establishing government commissions, they offered to buy the sacred lands from the natives. But for the Lakota, Paha Sapa was not for sale. Just as it is illogical and impossible for a person to sell their mother for money, it was equally impossible for them to sell the center of their beliefs. Rejected and yielding to its arrogance, the American government decided that where diplomacy and false promises ended, barrels, cavalry sabers, and cannons would speak. In late 1875, in the most freezing, merciless days of winter, an official ultimatum was sent to all free native bands. According to this order, everyone was to return to designated barren reservation areas by January 31st, 1876. Otherwise, regardless of treaty terms, they would all be declared hostiles and become the legal targets of the army. This was an order that was not only difficult to implement, but physically impossible. Traveling such a distance in the midst of freezing winter storms, under meters of snow, with women, children, and the elderly was a death warrant in itself. Moreover, for these people who had lived intertwined with nature and as free as the wind for thousands of years, reservations were no different from open-air prisons. When the deadline expired, the American War Department pressed the button to launch the largest, most comprehensive, and most ruthless native hunt in its history. The goal was very clear: to permanently subjugate and destroy the last independent tribes remaining on the Great Plains. The prepared military plan looked flawless on the maps in Washington. 3 massive military columns, advancing simultaneously from 3 different directions, would catch the enemy in a giant geographical pincer and crush them into surrendering without giving them a chance to escape. General Alfred Terry from the east and troops commanded by Colonel John Gibbon from the west were slowly advancing. But at the head of the third and most trusted column of the army, which set out from Fort Fetterman in Wyoming from the south, was one of the legendary names of American military history, Brigadier General George Crook. Crook was one of the most experienced, respected, and cunning commanders of the American Army in native wars. Known to his soldiers for his silence, toughness, and uncompromising discipline, and called the Gray Wolf by the natives for his cunning, this man was an unusual figure who preferred practical hunting clothes over ornate uniforms. The bloody experiences he gained in the Apache Wars had taught him a golden rule. You cannot defeat the natives with a massive and clumsy army. If you want to defeat them, you must move like them on the terrain, and most importantly, you must fight natives against natives. Setting out with this philosophy, the forces under General Crook's command were a massive and terrifying war machine by the standards of that era. Under his command were about 1,050 fully equipped regular American soldiers. This giant force of experienced cavalry units and infantry was accompanied by a supply train consisting of hundreds of mules. The soldiers held the deadly weapons of that era, single-shot but long-range Springfield rifles. However, the true power Crook relied on in this campaign was not his own soldiers, but the more than 260 native scouts he took with him. These were Crow and Shoshone warriors, the sworn enemies of the Lakota and Cheyennes for generations. These tribes, who had been losing their own lands in the face of the Lakota's relentless expansion for years, had seen allying with the American army, the enemy of their enemy, as the only way to survive. Crook knew very well that these experienced scouts would play a vital role in tracking the enemy and guiding his soldiers in the chaotic moments of battle. When he marched north with his army at the end of May, Crook was extremely confident. He believed with all his heart that he could easily scatter any native force that came his way and catch them off guard in their villages, making them flee in panic. This was the Army's standard tactic that had never failed for years. But the massive military reality hiding in the depths of the terrain, which General Crook and the entire American government failed to calculate, was something else entirely. The Army expected to find scattered, disconnected, irregular groups just trying to run away from the soldiers. Yet in the spring and early summer of 1876, an awakening and gathering unprecedented in history was taking place on the Great Plains. Uniting around the strong spiritual leadership of Sitting Bull, the wise leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota, the Lakotas, Cheyennes, and Arapahoes, had formed perhaps the greatest alliance in their history. The Oglala, Miniconjou, Sans Arc, Blackfoot Lakotas, and all other subgroups had set aside generations of internal strife and formed a moving city. This gathering was not just a military camp, but a nation standing shoulder to shoulder, fighting for its existence. Thousands of leather teepees, tens of thousands of grazing horses, and warriors numbering in the thousands, thirsty for battle. These men, blowing like the wind on their horses, were now prepared to fight not only to protect their honor, but to defend their lands, their families, and their entire existence. The military genius of this massive and furious force was the Oglala Lakota Crazy Horse, a man who was quiet and withdrawn, but moved like a god of storms on the battlefield. Crazy Horse had carefully observed the white man's battle tactics, military maneuvers, and psychology for years. He had analyzed their discipline and firepower, as well as their weaknesses and arrogance, very well. He knew perfectly well that American soldiers always expected the natives to use traditional hit-and-run tactics, scattering after firing a few shots. Crazy Horse was determined to shatter this exact arrogant expectation of the enemy. He would do something no native war chief had ever done before. Setting aside tribal independence, he would command his men like an organized, disciplined army and confront the military head-on with an unshakable aggressiveness. By mid-June, the tension had become tangible and breathtaking in the air. Sitting Bull had recently seen a shattering vision during the sacred sun dance ceremony. In that deep trance where he cut 50 pieces of flesh from his arms, shedding his blood onto the earth, and danced for days looking at the sun, hungry and thirsty, he had seen American soldiers falling upside down from the sky into the native camp, just like grasshoppers caught in a massive storm. This sacred vision had created an incredibly huge wave of morale and unshakable faith in the massive native camp. Believing that victory had been heralded to them by the spirits, the warriors were no longer afraid of death and were almost impatient to face the enemy. On June 16th, General Crook's army reached the valley of Rosebud Creek. After a grueling march that lasted for days, the soldiers made camp on the wide plains of the valley. Crook still thought the initiative was entirely his. Some tracks indicating a massive native presence around had been found. The Crow and Shoshone scouts were extremely nervous and apprehensive, sniffing the air and sensing the approaching terrifying storm from the restlessness of their horses. However, General Crook, succumbing to his own hubris, did not take these frantic warnings from his native scouts entirely seriously. As night fell, the soldiers comfortably lit their fires, boiled their coffee, relieved their exhaustion, and drifted into a peaceful sleep after cleaning their weapons. The valley was silent. The night was starry, cool, and calm. But under those silent stars, in the dark, steep hills miles beyond the camp, a page that would go down in world history was about to be written. Crazy Horse had already received news from his scouts that Crook's massive army had camped in the valley. Normally, when a native leader heard that an army with such high firepower was approaching, he would move his village to a safer place and avoid conflict to protect the women and children. But Crazy Horse categorically refused to stay on the defensive that night. That night, with a massive strike force of at least 1,500 Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who did not fear death, he began to flow silently like a flood through the darkness of the night, right onto the enemy without wasting any time. Adorning their faces with war paint, the colors of death, and holding both their traditional weapons and the rapid-firing rifles they had captured from white traders, thousands of warriors advanced south toward the Rosebud Valley, shoulder to shoulder with deep determination. Their goal was not to ambush Crook's army in their villages at a vulnerable moment. Their goal was to catch the enemy off guard and destroy them at an unexpected moment, on a rugged battlefield of their own choosing. With the first pale lights of the morning, the Rosebud Creek Valley was to become not just an ordinary battlefield, but the stage of a resistance the American army had never seen from any tribe before. As the darkness of the night slowly withdrew over the valley, General Crook's soldiers were still in that deep sleep, but the hell they would wake up to a few hours later would be the deadly rehearsal for one of the greatest shocks in American military history. Those first hours of the morning of June 17, 1876, were the moments when a storm was about to break that would go down as a dark stain in American military history and in golden letters in the history of Native resistance. It was around 8 o'clock in the morning. In the Rosebud Valley, the sun had not yet fully shown its usual scorching face, and a cool, peaceful air had settled over the wide valley. General Crook's soldiers were resting as if to make up for the grueling march that had lasted for days. Coffees were boiling over the campfires, bacon was sizzling, and hundreds of horses and supply mules were calmly grazing on the greenery by the creek. Most of the soldiers had stacked their heavy weapons, taken off their jackets, and were washing their faces by the creek or resting their muscles heavy with exhaustion. The command echelon, especially General Crook, was so relaxed that they thought the enemy was miles away, quietly making defense preparations, perhaps looking for an opportunity to take their families and flee the moment they saw the army. His military arrogance told him that, until that day, no native group would dare to willingly attack a massive and fully equipped American army consisting of thousands of soldiers. But this profound arrogance was soon to make them pay a bloody and deadly price. The Crow and Shoshone scouts sent on patrol toward the steep hills in the north of the valley, on the other hand, were very, very far from this complacency of the camp. They had already felt that invisible tension in the air, that subtle vibration coming from beneath the earth. The survival instinct brought by years, the ability to read nature and their sworn enemies, whispered to them that a great danger was approaching in a deadly silence. Suddenly, when the clock struck 8:30, a few gunshots echoed from the high hills in the northwest of the valley, cutting the serene silence of that morning like a knife. The soldiers in the camp initially attributed these sounds to the scouts finding and hunting a herd of bison. Almost no one felt the need to grab their weapons and run to the trenches. But seconds later, those sporadic gunshots were replaced by a deafening roar, a massive volley that echoed off the rock walls of the valley and made one's blood run cold. A wave of battle cries from thousands of people, shaking the earth and sky, began to accompany the gunfire. The scene that suddenly appeared on the horizon behind the hills was the kind of shock American soldiers had never seen, even in their nightmares. First a few, then dozens, and within seconds, hundreds of mounted warriors began pouring down from the hills into the valley. Their horses' manes waved in the wind, their faces and torsos shone with war paint, the colors of death, and the advanced rifles, traditional spears, and war clubs in their hands gleamed mercilessly under the morning sun. However, what truly terrified General Crook and his experienced officers was not just the numerical multitude of the attacking natives. The truly frightening thing was the way they entered the battlefield. Until that day, natives had always used scattered, irregular, short-term hit-and-run tactics based on individual heroism against the American army. But the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors descending from the hills into the valley that morning were attacking in broad waves with incredible order, tremendous coordination, and relentless determination, just like a disciplined, heavy European cavalry regiment. Crazy Horse was now flawlessly and mercilessly using the tactics of his enemy, which he had studied from afar for years, against them. Within seconds, complete chaos and panic broke out in the campground. Boiling coffee cups fell to the ground, and unfinished morning conversations gave way to terror-filled screams. Unarmed and half-naked, the bewildered soldiers began scrambling frantically toward their rifles and ammunition boxes. Horses were spooked, mules reared and broke their ropes, and the frantic orders of the officers were completely drowned out amidst the gunfire and native war cries. If everything had gone as Crazy Horse planned in those first few minutes, his warriors would have driven into the very heart of the camp like a wedge, putting the unprepared American soldiers to the sword and spear among their tents before they could even load their weapons. The Rosebud Valley would have become the grave of thousands of soldiers that morning, and American history would have had to write a much bigger, much bloodier fiasco than the Custer disaster right there that day. But right at that moment, an extremely critical event occurred that changed the fate of the battle and perhaps thousands of American soldiers. Those who saved General Crook's army from absolute annihilation in that first violent shockwave were not his own disciplined soldiers, but the Crow and Shoshone scouts who were despised within the army and mostly used for drudge work like tracking. Numbering around 250, these native allies did not retreat when they saw their sworn enemies, the Lakotas, descending upon the camp like a flood from the hills. They did not flee to the camp to seek a safe place. On the contrary, with incredible courage and a loyalty unto death, they rode their horses directly into the thousands of charging Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. The two native forces clashed right in the middle of the valley, under the astonished and grateful gazes of the American soldiers, literally hand-to-hand with terrifying violence. This clash was so brutal, so personal, and so bloody that the distant rules of modern warfare were replaced by thousands of years of primitive tribal hatred. The barrels of rifles spewed flames, long spears pierced chests, bone-crushing war clubs shattered skulls, horses tangled and fell over, and it was barely possible to distinguish friend from foe in the rising dust cloud. The Crow and Shoshone warriors, at the cost of sacrificing their own lives, had managed to halt that massive Lakota wave for about 20, perhaps 30 minutes before it reached the camp. Those 20 minutes bought with blood were a vital, literally saving period of time for General Crook. The Gray Wolf quickly shook off the shattering effect of the shock and began to intervene in the situation with the military experience and composure brought by years. Jumping on his horse half naked and shouting orders to his officers, he rallied the scattered, paralyzed soldiers and ensured they immediately formed defense lines. Infantrymen were positioned at critical points of the valley, and the cavalry mounted their horses and organized quickly. Weapons were loaded, bayonets were fixed. The single-shot Springfield rifles in the hands of the soldiers soon began to weave a deadly and dense wall of fire. A different front was opening in every corner of the valley, and the battle suddenly spread like a massive fire over a vast, rugged, and rocky area of square kilometers. The terrain where the battle took place seemed as if it had been specially designed by nature to thwart the strategies of both sides and to cause them to collapse physically and mentally. The Rosebud Valley was not a flat plain the soldiers were accustomed to. It was full of deep ravines, dry creek beds, steep rocks, blind spots, and sharp bluffs. This broken geographical structure almost completely neutralized the American Army's biggest advantage, which was full-scale cavalry charges and long-range regular firing lines. The soldiers climbed breathlessly to capture a hill, and just as they said, "We took this place covered in sweat and blood," they were met with the deadly fire of masterfully hidden native snipers from another hill next to it. This fragmented structure of the terrain, however, was a perfect, flawless playground for Crazy Horse's warriors. Thanks to their incredible maneuverability on horseback, they suddenly appeared from among the rocks, spewing death upon the soldiers, and disappeared like ghosts diving into deep crevices before the infantry could even turn their rifles in that direction. Crazy Horse watched this recovery of the army with cold blood and clever moves. The first stage of his plan, the idea of destroying the camp with an ambush, had been thwarted due to the unexpected suicidal resistance of the scouts. But he had no intention of stopping or retreating. Doing something no native leader had done before, he divided his massive force into tactical groups. While one group applied fierce pressure directly on the center of the soldiers, other groups circled around the right and left flanks of the valley to deal deadly blows to the flanks of the army, trying to tear the units apart and encircle them in a massive ring. Crazy Horse, on his horse covered in war paint, darted from front to front as if flying, giving instructions to his warriors and encouraging them with a spiritual power. His presence on the battlefield was like a legendary shield for the Lakotas and Cheyennes. In the battlefield where bullets rained down and the men around him fell one by one, he remained unscathed, riding fearlessly and deeply shaking the morale and psychology of the American soldiers. The officers were finding it increasingly difficult to keep their soldiers together. Companies began to break apart, and communication lines started to shatter. The faces of the soldiers were pitch black from gunpowder soot, their lips cracked from the smell of gunpowder and thirst. Deafening gunshots, horse neighs, screams of orders, and the cries of the wounded all blended together. The proud 3rd and 2nd Cavalry Regiments of the American Army were losing control of the battlefield step by step, and the initiative was slowly passing into the hands of the Native Alliance, which was tearing the army to pieces with clever moves. Many young American soldiers had already lost that arrogant gleam of conquest in their eyes, replaced only by a deep terror brought by the instinct to survive. Because they knew the truth very well, there was no retreating from this wild valley, no begging for mercy. Either they would water these steep rocks with their blood and hold them, or that day, in that valley, it would be the end of them all. As the first hours of the battle passed and the sun climbed mercilessly toward its zenith, a single question echoed in General Crook's mind. Where had this incredibly crowded, massively organized, and fiercely fighting native army come from? And how were they going to survive this hellfire that was clearly going to last for hours? As the sun climbed mercilessly toward the zenith, the air in the Rosebud Valley also turned into an unbreathable hell. That cool and refreshing breeze of the morning had long vanished, giving way to the heavy smell of gunpowder smoke, sweat, blood, and dust-covered horse breath. As the hours passed, the course of the battle had completely departed from the regular and disciplined frontline combat the American Army was used to, turning into a deadly cat-and-mouse game spread over a vast, rugged terrain. General Crook had set up his headquarters at a relatively low point in the valley and was trying to make sense of the apocalypse breaking loose around him. He was now feeling with every cell of his being that the force facing him was not an ordinary group of warriors, but a massive army that was very well coordinated. Yet the military habits brought by years and the remnants of hubris were still clouding his mind. Crook simply could not fathom that such a large native force could have left their families, tents, and provisions behind and traveled for miles just to fight. According to his logic, if they were resisting this fiercely, the massive village they were trying to protect must be right there, just a little further down the valley. It was this fatal delusion that would bring the American army to the very brink of disaster. In one of the most heated, critical moments of the battle, General Crook played a tactical gamble and assigned an elite cavalry unit of hundreds of men under the command of Captain Anson Mills to enter a narrow and steep canyon towards the north of the valley. His order was very clear. They would break through the natives' defense line, find that massive village presumed to be hidden, and force the warriors to surrender by taking the women and children hostage. This was the cruel but standard American military doctrine of that era, aiming to use civilians as a shield. As soon as Captain Mills received the order, he gathered his men and began to advance rapidly toward the canyon. But what Mills and his men did not know was that what was drawing the soldiers toward that dark throat of the valley was not a victory, but a flawless ambush. Between the narrowing walls of the canyon, Lakota warriors hidden in the hills were eagerly waiting to roll massive boulders and bury the soldiers alive in that narrow pass. If Captain Mills had continued to advance in that canyon, probably one of the greatest massacres seen in American military history would have taken place in that narrow pass, and the Little Bighorn disaster would have been rehearsed that day in that canyon. While Mills's unit was moving away toward the canyon, the main army left behind was left alone with a much greater danger. Deprived of his best cavalrymen, General Crook's defense lines had dangerously thinned out, and communication between the fronts had come to the point of complete severing. This was exactly the flawless moment Crazy Horse, who was watching the battlefield from a high hill like playing a game of chess, had been waiting for. With the signal he gave to his warriors, the main strike force of the native army changed direction and flooded toward that fatal weakness in the American lines, towards the steep ridges in the west where the troops commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William B. Royal were located. Lieutenant Colonel Royal and his men were left alone in a high, hilly terrain miles away from the main headquarters. The orders given for them to retreat had not reached them amidst the deafening noise and chaos of the battle. Suddenly, they found themselves in the middle of thousands of mounted warriors surrounding them. The clash on these hills was the scene of the bloodiest, most merciless, and most desperate moments of the battle. When Lieutenant Colonel Royal's men realized it was no longer possible to stay on their horses, they dismounted and frantically tried to take cover behind the rocks. Dust clouds covered the sun, and the battlefield was almost cloaked in twilight. The Springfield rifles in the hands of the soldiers had overheated from intense firing, and their barrels were too hot to hold. The mechanisms of many were jamming due to gunpowder residue, and as the soldiers tried to extract the bullets with their knives to clear the jams, they became targets for the relentless attacks of the natives. In contrast, many of the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors held rapid-firing repeating rifles of the Winchester and Henry brands, which they had bought from white traders for high prices or captured in previous battles. The most modern American troops of that era had fallen behind the natives in terms of firepower, and this fact further increased the terror on the faces of the soldiers. The warriors were practically dancing on their horses, hiding under the saddle to use the horse as a shield for themselves, and firing with incredible accuracy. Some rode their horses directly onto the soldiers taking cover, resulting in relentless hand-to-hand combat within the rising dust cloud. Traditional war clubs, rifle butts, bayonets, and knives were all mixed together. Lieutenant Colonel Royal's line was about to shatter. The soldiers were slowly forced to retreat, suffering heavy casualties, but every step back returned to them as new deaths and new wounded. The agonizing cries of the wounded soldiers mingled with the victory cries of the natives. Some soldiers froze in fear, while others were speared as they dropped their weapons and tried frantically to run away. These were the moments when arrogance was replaced by pure terror. Because until that day, the enemy they had faced was an enemy that retreated and hid when the army came upon them. Now, the enemy before them was attacking them mercilessly and continuously, crushing them and wanting to completely destroy them. Crazy Horse's leadership on the field accelerated the psychological collapse of the army. He appeared at every point of the battlefield, encouraging his warriors and directing them into organized attacks. He flawlessly calculated those few seconds of gaps when the American soldiers fired and reloaded, pushing his men forward in those brief moments and forcing the soldiers out of their trenches. By employing feigned retreat tactics, they ambushed the excited and inexperienced soldiers who rushed forward. The tactics of attrition and hunting that the army had applied to the natives on their own lands for years were now being tested on themselves in their most ruthless form. The desperation on the faces of the soldiers, the trembling in the voices of the officers, were the clearest evidence that the winds of war had completely turned. The Rosebud Valley had become not a battlefield for a massive American army, but a giant slaughterhouse. Watching the situation helplessly at the headquarters in the center, General Crook finally realized he was standing right on the edge of disaster. He could see that his left flank was about to collapse completely and that Lieutenant Colonel Royal and his men were on the verge of absolute annihilation. But worse still, he was only just comprehending that Captain Mills and his men, his most powerful trump card, were lost in the canyon. He bitterly understood that the canyon was a narrow death trap and that there was no native village there. Without Mills's men, it was impossible for them to hold out in this battle for even another moment. His entire army was on the verge of being torn apart and destroyed right before his own eyes because of his own flawed orders. Time was working against them. Every second, every minute meant another American soldier falling to the ground. General Crook had to give perhaps one of the most difficult, most desperate orders of his military career. He immediately tasked a trusted aide to find Captain Mills under deadly enemy fire and call him back at all costs. As the young messenger jumped on his horse and galloped toward the canyon under a hail of bullets, survival for the remaining troops was now dependent on a miracle. If that messenger was shot, or if Captain Mills did not return in time, not a single American soldier would survive in that valley that day. As the battle entered its 6th hour, the sun in the sky had turned the battlefield into a virtual oven with its scorching heat. The soldiers' ammunition was about to run out, the water in their canteens had long been depleted, and their lips had started to bleed from gunpowder and thirst. As Lieutenant Colonel Royal's troops began a desperate flight down from the hills as a last hope, the Lakota warriors riding behind them like angels of death had already caught the bloody and sweet scent of victory. Everything hinged on the speed of the messenger running toward that narrow canyon and that final tiny ounce of mercy fate would offer them. This bloody day in the Rosebud Valley had not yet spoken its final word, and the true moment of apocalypse for both sides would be experienced minutes later. The minutes General Crook's messenger galloped into that narrow canyon to save his entire army from absolute annihilation were, in fact, some of the longest, most breathtaking moments in American military history. The aide galloped toward those steep rocks amidst bullets buzzing around him, tearing through the air as if he were protected by an invisible shield. Amidst the deafening roar of the battlefield, that short turn-back order carried by this lone rider would determine the very thin line between life and death for hundreds of soldiers. The battle in the valley had now moved out of the realm of tactical maneuvering and turned into a completely primitive, savage, and ruthless struggle for survival. The sun had reached its zenith, turning the rugged terrain of the Rosebud Valley into a boiling cauldron indistinguishable from hell. For Lieutenant Colonel Royal and his men, the situation was now beyond even desperation. Completely surrounded by thousands of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, these soldiers were experiencing a fierce fight for their lives on the hill ridges. On those high and arid hills, the soldiers' ammunition was steadily running dry, and their overheated single-shot Springfield rifles were burning their hands. Due to gunpowder smoke and rising dust, one could not see a thing, and the soldiers were even struggling to breathe. Officers were tearing their throats out, shouting to keep their soldiers together and prevent that thin defense line from breaking, but their voices melted away amidst the war cries and gunshot blasts. The native warriors, on the other hand, seemed to never tire, steadily tightening the deadly circle on their horses with their incredible agility. The soldiers of one of the proudest regiments of the American Army could see with their own terror-filled eyes that they were approaching the inevitable end step by step, and that every single minute was working against them. Right in the heart of this chaos, an incredible event took place, one that is rarely talked about in the dusty pages of history, but is engraved in golden letters in the memory of the native people, summarizing the nature of the battle and the great motivation of the natives. Comes in sight, one of the proud chiefs of the Northern Cheyennes was left on foot and completely defenseless, caught in a crossfire right in the middle of the battlefield as a result of his horse being shot. The American soldiers, realizing they had caught a major target, immediately turned their barrels toward him. As bullets riddled the ground around him, it was clear to Combs in sight that the end had come and death was only seconds away. But right at that moment, From within that dense cloud of dust and gunpowder covering the battlefield, a rider dashed out blowing like the wind. Thinking this brave rescuer was an experienced warrior, the soldiers intensified their fire, but the approaching rider was the chief's sister, a young Cheyenne woman named Buffalo Calf Road Woman. Without blinking an eye, she dove right into the middle of that deadly crossfire, brought her horse rearing next to her brother, and managed to pull him up onto the back of the horse with incredible strength. Under the astonished gazes of the soldiers, she brought her brother out safe and sound from that hail of bullets and returned to their own lines. This incredible display of courage caused such a massive explosion of morale and pride among the Cheyenne and Lakota warriors on the battlefield that from that moment on, the warriors began to attack with a courage almost beyond death. In fact, this event became so legendary that the Cheyenne people never referred to this great battle as the Battle of the Rosebud. For them, the name of that day would forever remain the battle where the girl saved her brother. While the warriors intensified their attacks even more with the spiritual power they drew from this event, Lieutenant Colonel Royal finally had to give that fatal order to retreat in order to reunite with the rest of the army. However, this was not an orderly retreat, but literally a suicidal plunge down from a steep and rocky valley. Carrying their wounded comrades on their shoulders, the soldiers left their horses behind and began to descend, almost tumbling down the steep rocks. During this escape, the defense lines completely collapsed. The native warriors catching up from behind descended upon the fleeing soldiers like a nightmare. Terrifying hand-to-hand clashes took place on those steep slopes. Unable to find the time to load their rifles, the soldiers tried to survive with their butts, knives, and bare hands. If the Crow and Shoshone scouts had not stepped in once again to try and stop the native attackers at the cost of their own lives, not a single person from Lieutenant Colonel Royal's unit would have reached the bottom of that valley alive. While the blood of the soldiers painted the rocks of the Rosebud Valley red, the fate of the battle was still in the hands of the messenger riding to that narrow canyon. Meanwhile, miles away from the main center of the battle, Captain Mills and his men advancing in that narrowing throat of the canyon were approaching step by step toward that massive death trap prepared for them. The walls of the canyon were progressively narrowing, the sunlight was decreasing, and the surrounding silence was taking on an eerie nature. Mills was experiencing the unease of not being able to see any native village around, but General Crook's order was definite. He was going to advance and find that village. The Lakota warriors lying in ambush in the hills were holding their breath, waiting for the soldiers to enter that exact point of death, the narrowest part of the canyon. The soldiers were completely unaware of the massive boulders, thousands of bullets, and the shower of arrows that were going to rain down on them shortly. Right at that breaking point, minutes, perhaps seconds before the trap closed, the aide sent by General Crook plunged into the canyon on his horse covered in sweat and gasping for breath and reached Captain Mills. The message the messenger brought was very brief. "Return immediately. The army is being destroyed." When Mills heard this message, he experienced great astonishment. The man who hoped to find a village in front of him, and who perhaps thought he would be the hero of the battle, was now facing the reality that a whole army was about to collapse. But as a disciplined soldier, he did not hesitate at all. Turning those hundreds of cavalrymen around in the narrow canyon was an extremely difficult and risky maneuver, but even seconds mattered. When the natives waiting in ambush in the hills saw the soldiers suddenly stop and begin to turn back in panic, they realized the trap was broken. If Mills and his troops had advanced a little further in the canyon, they would have experienced Custer's fate 8 days before him. The failure of the trap was a very critical step that would once again change the course of the battle up to that point. Exiting the canyon quickly, Mills and his men rapidly advanced toward the heart of the battle, not from the way they came, but from the eastern flank of the valley. This return was not the arrival of ordinary reinforcements to the front. It was literally a rescue operation that changed the course of the battle and prevented the annihilation of General Crook. When Captain Mills's cavalrymen returned to the battlefield, they crashed violently directly into the flank of the Lakota forces that were about to destroy Lieutenant Colonel Royal's battered men and had encircled them. The sudden entry of this fresh cavalry unit with full ammunition into the battlefield created an unexpected shock effect for the native alliance. The warriors who had been relentlessly battering the American soldiers for hours, crushing their psychology and shouting cries of victory, were now shaken by intense rifle fire coming from behind them. Mills's men emerged from that suffocating dust cloud of the valley like angels of vengeance, opening a vital corridor between the central headquarters and Royal's crushed troops. Thanks to this unexpected move, the surviving soldiers of Lieutenant Colonel Royal stood shoulder to shoulder and dashed for their lives toward the main army, to the safe circle where General Crook was located. That distance of a few hundred meters extending from those high hills to the army headquarters was like passing from hell to heaven for the rescued soldiers. However, the place they reached could hardly be considered heaven. The soldiers were exhausted, their uniforms were torn to pieces, and their faces had become unrecognizable from gunpowder smoke. Everywhere was filled with the groans of the wounded and the neighs of suffering horses. General Crook had finally managed to bring his entire army together, but the price had been very heavy. The attacking power of his army was completely exhausted, and the initiative had entirely slipped from his hands. The arrogant commander who attacked and chased the natives was now gone, replaced by an anxious man trying to keep his army in a defensive position and survive. But on the opposite hills, Crazy Horse, who had calmly managed every moment since the beginning of the battle, had already made his assessment of the situation. He saw that the soldiers had reunited and that Mills had narrowly escaped the trap and rejoined the army. Normally, after such a long and grueling clash, especially when the enemy army had regrouped, many native leaders would have preferred to celebrate their victory and retreat. After all, they had achieved their main goal, stopped the advance of that massive army, and taught them a lesson they would never forget. But the war in Crazy Horse's mind was not over yet. Refusing to retreat, he gave new instructions to his warriors. The battle was now evolving from that wild hurricane of hand-to-hand combat into a ruthless war of attrition that slowly bled the American army and paralyzed them psychologically. The American army was now like a wounded animal trapped in a corner, and this massive native circle surrounding them had not the slightest intention of showing them mercy. With Captain Mills's critical, literally last-second vital intervention and the battered, bloodied troops of Lieutenant Colonel Royal barely joining the main army, the nature of the battle in the Rosebud Valley changed once again, but this time in a much more suffocating and psychologically draining way. After hours of chaos, General Crook had finally managed to gather all his soldiers within a narrow defensive circle that could be considered relatively safe in the valley. However, this was not a circle of victory proudly drawn by commanders on their battle maps, but literally a desperate trap of survival. The American army's aggressive nature, which it always took pride in, holding the initiative and giving its enemy no quarter, had completely collapsed. In its place came a tired, exhausted heap that was surrounded, its ammunition rapidly depleting, and just trying to save the day by staying on the defensive to avoid further casualties. Opposite them stood a massive, terrifying native army that, despite fighting relentlessly and savagely since morning, seemed to have lost none of its energy, fury, and tremendous organizational skills. Crazy Horse was a tactician brilliant and sensible enough to know that making a suicidal mass charge directly into this regrouped, tightly packed center of the army with intense firepower was illogical. Instead of drowning the soldiers in their own blood, he decided to turn this final stage of the battle into a merciless war of attrition that played with the enemy's nerve endings, bleeding them slowly, inch by inch. The warriors settled like deadly ghosts onto those steep rocks, high hills, and deep crevices surrounding General Crook's army. From that moment on, for the American soldiers, raising their heads even a few inches out of the trench meant instantly coming face to face with death, literally confronting the Grim Reaper. Particularly skilled Lakota and Cheyenne snipers possessing rapid-firing Winchester and Henry Brand rifles, acquired for exorbitant sums from white traders, began a deadly and highly accurate harassing fire upon the soldiers from high vantage points. Under the scorching sun that practically peeled off the skin, the soldiers were forced to just wait behind the hot rocks, helplessly cowering against the bullets raining down on them. When a private stood up slightly to fire his rifle, He became the target of several bullets coming from different directions within seconds. This static and oppressive situation began to inflict deep, irreparable, and staggering wounds on the psychology of the American Army's soldiers. Those young men who had entered that valley in the morning hours with great self-confidence, as if going on a picnic, thinking they would easily scatter the few savages they encountered and burn their villages, were now experiencing mental collapse and complete delirium in the face of this invisible enemy that surrounded them and played cat and mouse with them. The agonizing neighs of the horses, the heart-wrenching groans of the wounded writhing on canvas tents, and the native war cries echoing from the hills formed a terrifying, endless symphony of hell in the minds of the soldiers. Toward the afternoon, the sun's merciless heat had turned the battlefield into a literal giant oven. The soldiers' biggest enemy was now no longer just native bullets or flying arrows, but also an unbearable, throat-tearing thirst. The canteens had emptied hours ago in that initial chaos of the battle. Rosebud Creek was right next to them, the inviting sound of the water reaching their ears, but trying to reach that water was practically a definitive suicide mission. Because the edge of the creek was directly in the clear line of sight of the native snipers in the hills. A few desperate soldiers, driven mad by thirst and trying to run to the water, were shot instantly, and the cool, clear waters of the creek had long been muddied by the hot blood of horses and men, gunpowder residues, and mud. The soldiers were even willing to settle for muddy puddles among the rocks, just to wet their bleeding and cracked lips, which were parched from gunpowder smoke. The officers saw this miserable, soulless state of their men and realized with great terror that the ammunition crates were rapidly emptying. Even General Crook's famous, legendary composure had begun to shake in the face of this relentless and endless siege, that confident look in his eyes giving way to deep anxiety. Above all, the Crow and Shoshone scouts, who had fought shoulder to shoulder and prevented the complete destruction of the army since morning by using their own bodies as shields, had now also reached the point of physical and mental exhaustion. They had lost many valuable men from their own tribes, fought hand-to-hand to the death for hours against their sworn enemies, and now they had neither the strength to fight nor the motivation to spend for the white man's war. With hand gestures, in a harsh and definitive tone, the scouts explained to the experienced officers that advancing further or continuing to fight in this area was pure madness, and that they must retreat to safe zones immediately. It was slightly past 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The battle had been going on continuously for exactly 6 hours with savage and superhuman violence. These 6 hours were an incredibly long, unprecedented duration for the battle standards of that era, especially considering the pitched battles native tribes engaged in with the regular American army. Natives generally employed hit-and-run tactics, retreating rapidly to minimize their losses and protect their families after short, shocking skirmishes lasting an hour at most. But in the Rosebud Valley, thousands of warriors had fought front to front, tooth and nail, step by step, for exactly 6 hours with a massive American army equipped with modern weapons. This unparalleled resistance proved to the whole world that Crazy Horse was not just a tremendous military genius and a master tactician, but also an unmatched, charismatic leader capable of commanding those scattered, independent tribes as a single body, a single will. Yet there were also bitter truths that this great leader knew and weighed with his logic. His warriors had been on horseback under that scorching sun for hours. Their loyal war horses were exhausted in a lather of sweat, and most importantly, their ammunition was dangerously dwindling. Spending more of their bullets, which were extremely difficult and very expensive to buy, posed a great risk for them in the long run, for the larger battles approaching. Moreover, most importantly, they had more than achieved their main strategic goals. They had stopped the relentless march of that massive American army, trapped them for hours in a disadvantaged area of their own choosing, made them pay heavy prices, and did not allow them to take even a single step closer to their sacred villages, women and children behind them. They had struck that great primitive fear into the heart of the enemy, paralyzing them psychologically. Right at this point in the battle, Crazy Horse made that final, definitive decision worthy of his military intellect and common sense: retreat. But this was not like the disorderly flight of an army that had been routed in panic, cowardly. On the contrary, it was executed with incredible discipline. The warriors on the hills gradually, systematically ceased fire with a highly orderly, planned, and justified pride. First, they carefully took their wounded and the bodies of their brothers who had fallen on the battlefield with them, because leaving the body of a warrior to the enemy, preventing his soul from finding peace, was one of the greatest shames, one of the greatest sins for them. Then they calmly rode their horses north of the valley, back toward that endless horizon they came from, their shoulders held high. In just a few minutes, the American army watched that deadly, noisy crowd on the hills melt away like a fog cloud, with great astonishment, but with an even greater, indescribably immense feeling of relief. That hellish noise, gunshots, and screams that had descended upon the valley for exactly 6 hours were suddenly replaced by a deafening, eerie, and chillingly heavy silence. The barrels had gone quiet. The dust cloud was slowly dissipating. Only the bloody trickle of Rosebud Creek, the howling of the wind among the rocks, and the agonizing groans rising from the wounded soldiers among the tents could be heard. The nightmare was over. The enemy was gone. General Crook was trying to stand tall at the head of his ruined, soulless army in the middle of the battlefield. Upon the enemy leaving the field of their own accord, clinging to that strange, delusional arrogance of classical American military doctrine, he made that misleading on-paper statement that would go down in history. Since we remain on the battlefield, we won this battle. He was trying to make himself, his officers, and his superiors in Washington believe in this artificial victory. However, there was no victory to be celebrated, no hats to be tossed into the air. The sight he saw when he looked around was not the proud picture of a victory, but the picture of a narrowly escaped massacre, a massive wreckage. That empty blank stare on the soot-covered faces of his officers, the trembling hands of the soldiers holding their weapons, and the bloody bodies lying on the ground silently screamed how hollow, how meaningless this so-called victory was. Crook's massive army was literally paralyzed. They had neither the logistical power, nor the ammunition, nor the slightest mental courage left to take a single step forward and go after that massive native village to the north. The soldiers now knew very, very well what awaited them behind those steep hills. Advancing further from that valley meant absolute suicide, a mass grave for an entire army. General Crook knew very well inside just how heavy a strategic defeat he had actually suffered that day there at Rosebud Creek against the unbreakable, fierce will of the native people, and having to retreat his army would throw the door wide open for that legendary disaster that would take place only 8 days later, the Little Bighorn. That heavy and eerie silence that descended upon the battlefield was actually the harbinger of a much greater storm approaching, a massive hurricane that would change history. As General George Crook stood on the blood and gunpowder-smelling soil of the Rosebud Valley with his officers, he knew very well that declaring victory on paper would not be enough to cover up the defeat they actually experienced. The American army had suffered around 10 to 28 dead that day, and more than 50 soldiers had been heavily wounded. The numbers might seem small for a massive army, but the essence of the matter was not hidden in numbers, but in that deep psychological collapse the army fell into. Crook's soldiers had consumed a massive portion of their ammunition, about 25,000 rounds, scattering them in fear in that 6-hour chaos. Hundreds of soldiers needed medical treatment, the horses were exhausted, and most bitterly, the supposedly invincible will to fight of the army was completely broken. Never before had any tribe battered the American army so severely, condemned them to defend for hours, and then left the battlefield of their own accord in such a disciplined manner. Thus, Crook gave the order to retreat, making one of the heaviest decisions of his military career. Instead of advancing toward that massive native village which was their target, that is, the main area of operation, he turned the direction of his army south, toward his main camp at Goose Creek near present-day Sheridan. This retreat was not just a tactical step, but officially meant the bankruptcy of an entire military campaign, of that massive three-pronged pincer plan. That flawless strategy drawn with great hopes in Washington was torn to pieces by the natives' war clubs and rifles in the Rosebud Valley. When Crook reached Goose Creek, he would not be able to leave there for days, even weeks, and would literally remain imprisoned in his camp until reinforcements and new ammunition arrived. But the real tragedy was that due to the communication impossibilities of that era, this massive retreat was unknown to the other commanders. The other two military columns advancing from the east and west continued to march toward death, completely unaware that their strongest ally in the south had been knocked out of the war and defeated. Meanwhile, the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, who left the Rosebud Valley with a triumphant air, were met with unprecedented enthusiasm when they returned to their camps. The songs sung and dances performed around massive campfires that night were a celebration not just of a won battle, but of a total spiritual awakening. That shattering vision Sitting Bull saw during the sun dance, that sacred prophecy of soldiers falling from the sky upside down, had now begun to turn into reality in the eyes of the warriors. They had stopped the enemy's most feared commander, the Gray Wolf, and repulsed his massive army. With this unmatched morale and unshakable self-confidence, the native camp uprooted and migrated a little further west, toward that wide river valley they called Greasy Grass in their own language, and which the white man knew as the Little Bighorn. There, they would hold the largest gathering in their history, establishing a massive moving city consisting of thousands of teepees and a population of about 8,000 people. The warriors were no longer afraid of soldiers, rifles, or death, believing with all their hearts that the spirits of their ancestors were fighting by their side. This is how history is written with such cruel and flawless irony. Exactly 8 days after the Battle of the Rosebud, on the morning of June 25, 1876, General George Armstrong Custer and the legendary 7th Cavalry Regiment were approaching the Little Bighorn Valley, completely unaware of what they would find before them. Custer, just like Crook did 8 days ago, had succumbed to his arrogance and sense of racial superiority. He thought that before him was a weak group of natives who were disconnected, scattered, and would abandon their tents and flee in panic when they saw the cavalry. He did not know that General Crook's army had been torn to pieces 8 days ago, and that the native alliance before them possessed incredible military discipline, massive self-confidence, and modern rapid-firing rifles. If the telegraph lines had extended to this wilderness at that time, or if Crook had somehow managed to get the news of his own defeat to the other units without letting his pride get in the way, Custer would never have entered that valley so blindly, dividing his army into pieces. But fate had already spun its webs, and that deadly symphony that started in the Rosebud Valley was preparing to play its final note with a deafening roar at the Little Bighorn. When Custer and his soldiers attacked the valley, confident that they would win a victory, they experienced a massive shock just like Crook's soldiers did. However, their end would not be as lucky as Crook's. Facing them was a united army that had perfected the art of warfare at Rosebud, reached the peak of self-confidence, and did not even consider retreating. Crazy Horse displayed that aggressive tactic of attacking frontally and tearing the soldiers apart, which he had perfected at Rosebud that day, on Custer's soldiers this time, in a much bloodier and deadlier manner. In just a few hours, Custer and all 5 companies directly under his command were annihilated on those dusty hills, leaving not a single person alive. When the American public heard this news, in the midst of the country's centennial celebrations, it plunged into deep shock and great mourning. The newspapers of the era kept talking about Custer's heroic resistance and the unprecedented ruthlessness of the savages. Yet the true architect of that great disaster, the event that prepared the military and psychological groundwork for that destruction, was that forgotten epic written on the steep rocks of Rosebud Creek on June 17th. History books generally tend to narrate this period under the name of Indian Wars, as if it were the clearing of minor obstacles in the path of an inevitable march of civilization. However, Rosebud is the strongest historical document proving how incomplete, arrogant, and biased this narrative is. The natives who fought in that valley that day were not mere rebels or mindless savages trying to stop the advance of whites. They were patriots fighting for the most basic human right, the right to live, believe, and exist freely on their own lands. The leadership Crazy Horse reflected on the field that day was a kind of strategic genius you could see in the commander of any modern army in the world, using every inch of the terrain to his advantage, analyzing the weak points of the enemy in seconds, and directing his soldiers to those points was a challenge flawless enough to be taught in military academies. But the American Army blindly believed in its own institutional superiority so much that instead of giving credit to this strategic brilliance facing them, they always preferred to attribute the situation to bad luck or circumstances. General Crook's obligatory, paralyzing wait at the Goose Creek camp had actually shown how fragile the American military machine could be in the face of nature and local realities. The Crow and Shoshone scouts fighting alongside him had left the army and returned to their own lands immediately after the battle, because for them, the war was over. They had faced their sworn enemies, had done more than their share, and had managed to survive that hell. They saw no reason to continue being a part of this endless operation initiated by the white man for his own greed for land. Their departure had left Crook's army completely blind and deaf, not only logistically, but also in terms of intelligence. This situation slapped them in the face once again with how doomed to failure military campaigns in the West were without understanding the local dynamics and respecting the rules of that geography. On the other hand, this victory the Lakota and Cheyennes achieved at Rosebud also deeply affected that ancient and complex web of intertribal relationships. Years of intertribal disagreements, resource struggles, and individual conflicts had been set aside thanks to the spiritual integration brought about by this great victory. The chiefs gathering around Sitting Bull's tent now felt that they represented not just their own families or clans, but a single great invincible nation. But this great unification, unfortunately, as a historical tragedy, was to be a very short-lived dream, because the enemy facing them was not a structure that would give up by losing a single battle or sacrificing a regiment. The United States of America was an unstoppable empire with endless massive factories, millions of immigrants, thousands of kilometers of steel railways, and an infinite weapon production capacity behind it. The victories of Rosebud and the immediately ensuing Little Bighorn were the brightest, proudest military peak in the thousands of years of Native history. But at the same time, it was that last, most magnificent, most melancholic glare that painted the sky red before the sun of their independence set. After those legendary June days, when the freezing cold of winter arrived, the revenge of the American government turned into a massive slaughter that recognized no military rules. The armies returned, villages were burned, the bison, which were their source of life, were systematically exterminated by state policy, and those spirits as free as the wind were dragged into a dark fate. But today, if you go to the Rosebud Valley, even if you hear nothing but the whisper of the wind in those silent and vast lands, you feel that those rocky hills have never forgotten the day arrogance was broken and military dogmas were shattered. That is the place where the harshest, most uncompromising, and most honorable message left to history by a people was written right before they were driven to extinction. History leaves us a lesson written in blood in the Rosebud Valley. No army is invincible, and the resistance of those fighting for their freedom is measured not by the size of the enemy, but by that unquenchable fire in their hearts.